So good morning, everyone, and welcome. A special welcome to everyone on campus for Friends and Family Weekend. We are so pleased you are visiting your students and do so much to support them. I want to thank all of you for joining us for today's Kenner Lecture, Making the World Safe for Democracy, a conversation with Ambassador Karen Pierce. Today's lecture marks the opening of the Albright Institute's programming this year entitled The Diplomat's Toolbox, Making the World Safe for Democracy. In honor of Secretary Albright's legacy, as we carry her spirit and efforts forward, we seek to recognize and build upon her unwavering commitment to advancing democracy across the globe, and reflect on how she relied on her own set of diplomatic tools, her relationships, her empathy, and her principles to succeed. I'm certain that today's lecture will be a fascinating conversation and a wonderful introduction to another remarkable year of the Albright Institute's programs and events. I'd like to begin by thanking those who helped to make today's conference possible. I want to say a special thank you to Ambassador Pierce, who we are so pleased to host as our distinguished guest, and great thanks to our phenomenal Albright Institute team, including Faculty Director, Professor Stacie Goddard, Special Projects Coordinator, Julie Lanza, and Assistant Director of Academic Conferences, Beth Robichaux, for your efforts to prepare for today and for all you do for our Albright Fellows and the entire Wellesley community. I'd like to also offer a special welcome to Alice and Ann Albright, who are with us today. I know that your sister Katie was unable to join us today, but I'm sure she is here with us in spirit. Thank you for helping us to celebrate your mother's legacy. In addition to all that Secretary Albright gave to the world, her heart was always with Wellesley, and what she gave to the college and to our students is something that we will cherish for generations and will have impact for generations to come. I'd also like to welcome Secretary Albright's fellow classmates from the class of 1959 who are with us. And lastly, I'd like to thank Hunja Laskin Kenner, class of '88, and Jeffrey Kenner for establishing the endowed fund that supports the Kenner Lecture Series and enables us to put on events like today's. This is a critical moment for democracy, both here in the United States and elsewhere. I know that Ambassador Pierce and Professor Goddard will have a lot to say about that shortly. The international rules-based system and the institutions that support and protect it are increasingly under threat. Across the world, illiberal leaders are exacerbating societal divisions, encouraging tribalism, and increasingly turning to violence to gain and maintain control. As Secretary Albright herself argued in her brilliant and prescient book, Fascism: A Warning, fascism now presents a greater threat to peace and justice than it has at any time since the end of World War II. She would know, as a refugee from Czechoslovakia, totalitarianism wasn't abstract to the Secretary. And as a member of a family who fled the Nazis in 1938 and then the communists in 1948, she had an intimate understanding of the darkest political movements of the modern world. Up through her final months, she was writing and speaking out however she could about their threat and, sadly, their resurgence. But in spite of this grave threat, she was hopeful and never stopped believing in democracy. You can see her hope reflected in the generations of women diplomats who followed in her footsteps and who count her as a personal hero. You can see her hope, too, in the generations of Wellesley students, some of the most engaged students in the United States. And so, as perilous as the time may be, I have hope, and I have the Secretary and all those that she inspired to thank for that. So now, as we honor Secretary Albright's legacy, it's up to us to carry on her efforts and her fierce defense of freedom, human rights, and democratic governance. This is no small task. But if we use the tools that the Secretary counted on throughout her path-breaking diplomatic career, and if we join together across difference to unite in defense of shared values, I believe we can strengthen our collective capacity to both defend democracy and nurture the institutions and values that allow it to flourish. To the Albright ambassadors gathered here today, and to all of our students who wish to make a positive difference in the world, the Secretary's legacy is a bold invitation to you to share her commitment to strengthen democracy at home and around the world. It is my hope that you embrace this invitation and that you inspire others to do so too. As Secretary Albright put it in an op-ed that was published in the Washington Post shortly after she passed, and here I'm quoting, "There is no shortage of worthwhile work to be done and no surplus of seasons in which to achieve our goals. So let us buckle up our boots, grab a cane if we need one, and march." Let's honor her profound spirit and courage. So now I'd like to introduce today's panelists. Karen Pierce is the British ambassador to the United States. Prior to arriving in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Pierce was the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York since March of 2018. Prior to this role, Ambassador Pierce served as the Director General for Political Affairs and Chief Operating Officer of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London from 2016. Ambassador Pierce joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1981. Her first role was in Tokyo between 1984 and 1987, after which she returned to the UK to work in the Security Police Department. Security Policy Department. Sorry, very different. She worked in Washington as the private secretary to the British ambassador to the United States between 1992 and 1995. Between 1996 and 2006, Ambassador Pierce held several positions in London, including team leader for Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, deputy head of the Eastern Adriatic Department, head of newsroom, head of EU department, and concurrently head of Afghanistan political military unit after 9/11, before returning to the Balkans as Balkan coordinator from 2002 to 2006. In 2006, Ambassador Pierce moved to New York for the first time to be the Deputy Permanent Representative and Ambassador to the UK mission to the UN. In 2009, she returned to London to become the Director of South Asia and Afghanistan Department and the UK's Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. In 2012, Ambassador Pierce started her second multilateral role, where she was the ambassador and permanent representative to the UK mission to the United Nations, World Trade Organization, and other international organizations until 2015. Between 2015 and 16, she was the UK's ambassador to Afghanistan. So without a doubt, today we will hear from a person, a leader, who has spanned the breadth of the globe. Secretary Pierce will be joined on stage by Stacie Goddard, the Paula Phillips Bernstein Class of '58, Faculty Director of the Madeleine Korbel Institute, and the Betty Freihoff Johnson, class of 44, Professor of Political Science. I am so grateful that Ambassador Pierce is with us today to share her invaluable insight, and I'm so looking forward to her conversation with Professor Goddard. Now, please join me in welcoming the Ambassador and Professor Goddard to stage.
Thank you, President Johnson, for that wonderful introduction, and just to express my thanks to everyone in the audience for being with us today. Thank you especially to the Albright Fellows, who I know are out there. Thank you to the Albright Ambassadors for your continued stewardship. Thank you to the class of 1959 for joining us today. And thank you especially to Alice and Ann Albright for being here, for supporting us as we honor your mother's legacy. As President Johnson said, what we're doing in the Kenner Dialogue here is kicking off our year of Albright Institute programming. And the theme of this program is the Diplomat's Toolbox, making the world safe for democracy. And as you can tell, this is really about honoring Secretary Albright's legacy in so many ways. It's about recognizing her storied career as a diplomat, as well as recognizing her passionate commitment to democratic values, both at home and abroad. So I can think of no better person to have a conversation about this right now than with Ambassador Pierce. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will talk about your career in a moment, but I actually want to start with a more general question, and that is this question about democracy. There is a sense that democracy is facing its most intense challenge than it has since the middle of the last century. That obviously wasn't a good time. We're looking at Russia's aggression in Ukraine. We're looking at democratic backsliding across the globe. We are looking at the rise of transnational movements that have no problem speaking out against democracy. How would you evaluate these challenges? How great is this threat?
Well, thank you very much, Professor, and thank you, Principal Johnson, and enormous thanks to the Institute for inviting me today, and very nice to see my good friend Alice and Anne here. I did want to start by paying tribute to Secretary Albright. As the principal said, she was an absolute embodiment of the spirit of freedom. And I remember watching when I was first posted to Washington and the Bosnia War was raging, and I would watch her up at the UN, where she was the American permanent representative, and I'd watch her call on the UN again and again to do more, and we were cheering her on. She was exactly right about that. And if I may say so, I think that informed my own approach when I went to work on the Balkans and also working on Afghanistan. And I had the very great privilege to have dinner a few times in Washington as ambassador with Secretary Albright and also General Powell. And the way the two of them together debated their differences and were still the best of friends was one of the most inspiring things I've seen. It was also a fantastic set of role models. To answer your question, Stacie, I think the Russians over the past few years have, if you like, been building up to this moment. They may not have intended a few years ago to invade Ukraine, but they have taken the view since President Putin came to power that it would be the end of the West and that they were in a competition to reset the rules of international affairs. And China, a more assertive China, which I think will be the defining issue in the early part of the 21st century, China has joined them in that. And I'm sorry to say, as you said, they have some success. And they've had some success on the human rights side. They've had some success in economic measures. They've had some success, China particularly, in using Chinese investment to get countries very much on their side. And we in the West have been slow about that. We don't have a good offer for developing countries so that we can counter the bad side of the Chinese Belt and Road program. So we are going to have to get our act together on that. And President Biden has been leading G7 discussions. I do sometimes wonder if we ourselves have contributed to this by assuming that there is only one linear path to economic and political prosperity, that we have sometimes been too willing to proselytize rather than listen. And we are very good in the West at talking to people who agree with us, and we're much less good at finding common ground with people who might disagree with us overall, but we could find a way forward. So I think we need to try harder, and I think we also need to take the spirit of Secretary Albright and find champions who can actually call that out. She was a brilliant speaker. She could put things in words that ordinary people could understand. In the 1940s, so about 80 years ago, FDR and Churchill produced a document, and it was all about why open societies are better for ordinary citizens. We need to get back to that level of philosophical debate.
I'd like to pick up on something that you said, and this is, in some ways, what I'd almost think of is a tension between building unity among democracies on the one hand, but also not doing that in a way that's exclusive on the other. Because if there has been one bright side to what's been going on, it's increased unity in Europe, it's increased unity between the United States and Europe, especially on the issue of Ukraine. But you just said that too much exclusivity might actually undercut what democracies are trying to do. Can you talk a bit more about this? How should democracies be reaching out?
I don't think you can have too much unity, and I don't think you can have too much transatlantic unity, especially given what's happening in Ukraine. But I think we do need to be careful that the institutions we all built after the Second World War, like the IMF, like the World Bank, like the WTO, like the UN itself, have enough space for different views to be debated and a common position reached that actually delivers something practical for developing countries. And I think fundamentally there is a silent middle of countries out there in the world, some of them emerging powers and markets, new kids on the block if you like, and it's absolutely right that they should have a stake in all these institutions so that they can be dynamic and they can reform. They don't like taking sides between East and West as they see it, and we sometimes ask them to do that a little bit too much. But I think the other issue that they confront, this silent middle, is that democracy is messy, it's difficult. They might look at our politics and think, we don't want any of that, thank you. They might look at some of our social issues and think we don't want any of that. We are not doing a good enough job, I think, of explaining why authoritarianism eventually retards your growth as a nation, retards the development of individual human beings, and stifles opportunity.
I was struck in your initial comments talking about your role in the Balkans in the sense that there needed to be more done, particularly initially. And now thinking specifically about what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, in the last few weeks we have seen missile strikes against cities, consistent threats of using nuclear weapons. This is a conflict that's very likely to keep going on. Do you think that Europe and the United States are doing enough?
I think what Ukraine has achieved is absolutely remarkable, and I don't think, if we're honest, we thought they would be able to do this much at the start of the conflict. I think we need to keep on doing what we're doing at greater intensity. We supply Ukraine with defensive weapons. These are all about fighting the Russians inside Ukraine. I don't think we can stress that enough. This is not about seeking a wider conflict with Russia. I think we're coming to the realization that we need to do more for Ukraine's economy so that those bits of Ukraine, principally in the West, that are stable can thrive. But alongside that, we need to do something about the structural reforms that partly led to the disintegration of Russia's relationship with Ukraine to start with. So that's a complicated subject which I won't go into, but this is a chance to help rebuild those parts of Ukraine that are stable. And we need to work with the Ukrainians so that eventually they can negotiate from strength. And we need to define what that means.
And all of this has been costly to the countries that are supporting Ukraine, right? So Europe and the UK are on the edge of an energy crisis. There's obviously ongoing supply chain issues. This is likely to spread over for years to come into food insecurity because of what has happened to Ukrainian wheat. How should the UK and Europe be managing this? And how should these countries be helping others, such as, for example, on issues of food insecurity, manage through this crisis as well?
I think it goes back to that unity we were talking about earlier. There is remarkable transatlantic unity, even though the energy crisis might be very severe for some European countries this winter. And I think fundamentally it all comes back to what animated Secretary Albright, having seen both the worst of fascism and the worst of communism. If we allow the conflict in Ukraine to go on and the Russians to take over, the lesson of that is absolutely awful. And as we saw in the 1940s, it will lead to something worse. So it's not that we have a choice, as Kissinger said, between perfect options. If we do not do something to stop Putin now, more countries will suffer, more people will be hurt. You're quite right about the food security point. The Russians have done quite a good job of saying to people there is a food security problem because of sanctions. I can assure you this is not true. The sanctions do not affect anything to do with the shipment of grain out of Russia and Ukraine. It is the blockade of Russian forces in the Black Sea. Nevertheless, the UN and the Turks have been able to negotiate an agreement to allow that grain to come out. We need to accelerate that. We need to find alternatives to certain sorts of fertilizer so that those countries who get the grain can actually then continue planting. And we need a better distribution system. Now, some of that we needed anyway, but I think this has really thrown the spotlight on how the UN needs to find ways to help developing countries access supply.
So another, and I hate to call it a bright spot, but let's call it a bright spot, in the midst of this crisis has certainly been, to my mind, kind of a rebuilding of the relationship between the United States and its partners, the United States and the UK in particular, and this is obviously very much your job. What areas right now do you think are a particular strength, particularly when trying to shore up democracy, and where do you think things could be a little stronger in the relationship between the US and UK?
I think a lot about the future and the future challenges. The embassy's work and that of the consuls general around the network, and I have my colleague Peter Abbott, who's the consul general in Boston here today. Fundamentally, we're grouped around 4 core purposes. One is shared endeavors in war and peace, and to be America's ally number 1, and that's the traditional thing people think of when they think of the UK-US special relationship. The second one I would think of in terms of forging common frameworks for all these new thematic challenges, which include the threat to democracy and open societies, but they also include migration and climate, and I think critically new technology. I do worry about new technology. I think it's the equivalent of nuclear in the 1950s, and just as we had to develop conventions and rules and alliances to cope with the whole gamut of issues that nuclear power and energy threw out, we are going to have to do the same eventually for technology. So I think about that a lot, and we have a partnership with the US on this. Then obviously the economic relationship. We are each other's strongest traders and investors. Taken overall, that's about $1 trillion in both directions a year. Every day, 1.7 Americans go to work for British companies investing in the US. So there's always more that can be done on that. And as I go around all the individual states of America, Republican or Democrat, We always find that the governors are really keen to work with us on this and try and find ways of harnessing new technology. And then lastly, I would say the people-to-people links. Compared with maybe last century, perhaps not so many Americans have natural family ties to Europe or the UK and vice versa. As the demographics change, we need to find ways of keeping us interested and interesting to America so that you have a good impression of us and we can use those people-to-people links to do more about these challenges we're discussing.
Can I actually ask you to pick up on technology and what you see in particular as a threat from technology? Because certainly there are a lot of arguments that it took the United States, the UK, and a lot of European countries a while to wake up to the idea that this could actually be a threat to democracy.
I'm worried about that. I'm also worried that I don't know what the threats are from technology. I think if you can define something, you can be less scared of it. And I'm worried that there are directions new technology might go into. It's my job to think about the competitive advantage of the United Kingdom and the West. So I do worry that the Chinese and Russians might get a technology that we have not got, and that might shift the balance of power in somewhere like Ukraine or the South China Sea. I worry that we don't quite have the organization right to develop new technologies. Nobody wants government to be dictating how to innovate, because that's the fastest way to make sure you don't innovate. At the same time, some of the challenges and the emerging science are so difficult that perhaps only government can provide the money and the overall resources to tackle them. And I don't think we yet know how to get that balance right between government and private sector.
So I want to shift gears a bit, because I want to talk about some of the places that you've been involved as a diplomat over your career. And going through your bio, going through all that you've done, one thing that stood out is you're not somebody who runs away from a crisis. As a matter of fact, it oftentimes looks like you run towards them. So I want to talk a bit first about your work in Afghanistan. So you become UK ambassador to Afghanistan in 2015?
That's right.
I believe. What made you want to do that? What kind of diplomatic skills did you think you were bringing there? What did you hope to accomplish?
Well, Alice, if I may, I blame your mother. You know, this is the thing she really, I learned from her activities. Run towards the gunfire. It will be much worse if you don't take these problems head on when you still have an opportunity to do something about them. So that has animated me. I worked on Afghanistan immediately after 9/11, and so I've always been interested in it. But what really motivated me to go there, I wasn't sure that I wanted to go and live there as ambassador. The security situation means you leave your family behind. It's very difficult. You can only travel with a close protection team. You can't even go out and eat in a cafe. It's incredibly difficult on the ground. But I remembered that I'd had a boss who had written on one of my appraisals, she is destined to be the most senior woman the Foreign Office has. And I thought that was nicely ambiguous, because, you know, it might have meant nobody rose very far at all. But at the time, I'd had a couple of setbacks in my career, and I thought, I can't make good on what he was kind enough to write unless I do something that shows I can survive in really difficult terrains. And prior to Afghanistan, my postings have been Washington, New York, Tokyo, and Geneva. So it was time to put something back into the pot. And in the end, having talked to my husband and my children, it was that spirit that made me want to go.
And you talked about this as in many ways running towards the gunfire.
Definitely.
I feel like this is almost too broad, but what were, when you got there, what were the challenges that you felt like you were compelled to dive into?
So I had watched Afghanistan since 9/11. I'd actually worked on it 4 times, but from London. And all the previous times when we'd flown in, we flew in darkness in a military plane, and there were no lights on anywhere except at the military part of the airport. And when I flew in as ambassador, I went on a commercial plane. The streets were full of food, really good quality fruit and vegetables. The streets were full of people, some in Western dress, most in traditional dress, but there were families out and about, bustling around. And I thought, this is great, this has come good. This is really what we were meant to achieve in Afghanistan. Interestingly, it came at a very high security price. The security risk was very random. And the problem with random security is it's very hard to plan for. So we put a lot of the embassy's energies into the economy. And I was quite surprised at myself for this, because I would think of myself as a politico-military person, a securocrat. And I was really interested in the security challenges of Afghanistan. But actually, when we looked at it, part of the problem was that people didn't have jobs. There was no proper training in the ministries. There were lots of very well-intentioned people, but no proper programs. There was not even a proper system of private property. There was no commerce. And so we set about to put these right, and I had a very good economic development team from the British equivalent of USAID. We helped get Afghanistan into the World Trade Organization. We helped sort out some of the private sector issues. We helped investors come into Afghanistan. And bizarrely, if I think about it, that's what I would be most proud of, because it hadn't been done until we took a good look at it. And we had to offer the embassy as a meeting ground between the private sector and the government, because they couldn't go into the government offices, because everybody thought this sort of thing was too alien. So it was not a straightforward thing, but it was the right thing to do.
Turning to the present day, I know thinking about August, September 2021, it became very clear that Secretary Albright had not abandoned her commitment to Afghanistan, and she worked tirelessly on issues of asylum and refugees. And I know that your commitment there is also quite deep. The United States and UK both have a policy that normalization with the Taliban will not happen until progress is made on counterterrorism, on having a more inclusive political system, as well as on women's rights. I'm curious to hear whether or not you think that normalization possible, and what efforts do you think you can do, either government, but also, again, you're so very individually tied.
Well, speaking for the government, then obviously that's the right policy. Speaking personally, I think this is a really hard question. The whole point of conditionality depends on the government you're trying to put the conditions on understanding and wanting to do something about unlocking the resources for their people that other governments are offering to provide. And if you've got a government, a regime like the Taliban, that fundamentally does not care about its people, and where there is no voting mechanism, so they can't be voted out of office, then conditionality works less well. And you have to fall back on humanitarian assistance. We also work a lot through countries like the Qataris, who were actually instrumental in opening the airport for the evacuation last year. They find it easier to be able to chart a practical path through with the Taliban on certain issues. But it is inch by inch, I'm very sorry to say. And they promise us that the schools will stay open, and then the schools close. So then we have to go back in and try and get them open. So I'm not sure we've got the right formula yet to answer your question. Nevertheless, there is humanitarian assistance going in, and we do talk to the Taliban about what moves on their part would unlock more assistance from our side, and we still support NGOs working in Afghanistan to help individual communities. It's a long way from satisfactory.
Another place where you have a history of running towards the gunfire is in the Balkans. Can you say a little bit about how you got involved in Balkan, in politics in the former Yugoslavia?
Just before I came to Washington the first time in late 1991, the crisis in Bosnia was kicking off, and the UN was not having an effective response, as Secretary Albright so eloquently said. And things were happening like Bosnian Serb forces were stopping ministers in their cars who were protected by UN troops and shooting them dead in front of UN troops. And they were loading people on trains. And I had this very strong feeling that if you say never again, which we did after the Holocaust, then we should mean it. You can't make these promises and not think they have consequences. So I thought, well, you know, I'm going to be part of the group of people who are going to try and do something about this. And as I went back to London, having been in Washington, and Richard Holbrooke got the Dayton Peace Agreement, which is a landmark achievement of its time, though not without problems later, I got myself involved in the Balkans. And I just had my second son, and I remember getting a call from a senior member of the Foreign Office saying, you need to come back to work now, you need to come and work on Bosnia. And I thought, well, I've just had a baby, and now what do I do? But I had a good supportive family, and to be honest, a good nanny, and we made it all work. And so I went back, and it was one of those things that the more you saw of the awful things people had done to each other on the ground, the more you wanted to get involved and help put a stop to it. And as I go around the administration and Congress, I meet so many people who, one way or another, were involved in the original Bosnia crisis. And that really animates people. I'm happy to say that we worked on the war criminals particularly, and by the end of all the 56 indicted war criminals, either all of them were at the tribunal or they were dead. And I think that's a particular thing to think about as we look at Ukraine.
And so how robust do you think that process of transitional justice is now? Because certainly, I mean, with everything going on, I think the issues like Kosovo kind of fall off the radar. But if you look at this summer, for example, there were protests with a lot of Serbs within Kosovo basically rejecting the authority of the central government. Is this something you're worried about? Do you think that there's a decent foundation there? Or is this a conflict that we should all maybe put back on our radars?
I think after the initial success of the Dayton Peace Agreement and the Kosovo campaign in 1999, we took our eye off the ball and we got a bit complacent. And we didn't notice that the opposition forces were growing in strength, and we didn't notice Russian funding and interference, which very nearly toppled the legitimate elected government in Montenegro. And we do worry now that one of the effects of Ukraine might be to empower Russian interference even more in the Balkans. I also think we're not always courageous enough, to be absolutely honest. You know, we came out with this halfway house on Kosovo in 1999, where it wouldn't be either independent or part of Serbia. And with the benefit of hindsight, we should have taken a deep breath and said it's independent and put the troops in to protect that. We get a bit nervous of using troops, but I am sorry to say sometimes you don't have an alternative if you want to make a difference on the ground. And I'm not talking about Ukraine, I'm talking about peacekeeping.
And that actually brings me to another question, which is looking at your work, and this is particularly when you were on the Security Council, you were an extremely vocal proponent of human rights and of defending human rights. I was thinking specifically about some of your statements about the Rohingya in Myanmar. Is there more that the international community should be doing right now to defend human rights? And how do we make that determination, right? There are obviously unintended consequences of military intervention. What's the moment where we say enough is enough, never again?
It's such a good question. It's such a tricky one, and it deserves, if you like, to be the cause of your students, because we haven't got the right formula. We did try, collectively, the international community tried with something called the responsibility to protect, which had 3 pillars. And the first one, loosely speaking, was where a country itself comes to the UN and the international community and asks for help. Mexico did that. They wanted to transform their human rights legislation. The UN helped. Then the second basket, if you like, is where a country doesn't ask for help, but the international community concludes that help should be given, and then initiates from the UN side a dialogue and help and people to go in and try and help put things right. And then the third would be military intervention. And obviously, the first two pillars are the way to go, but it's not a perfect world and it's not a perfect choice. And unfortunately, responsibility to protect, though a very good intellectual concept, never took off. So we never got the funding or, if you like, the intellectual heft to make pillars 1 and 2 really work well. And I would say nothing kills a good idea like surfacing it at the wrong time. It was just a bit too ahead of its time. Now we have sanctions, but it's very rare that sanctions induce better behavior, I'm sorry to say. What sanctions do, as they are doing in Russia, is retard Russia's ability to wage war and retard Russia's ability to attack Ukraine and other countries and have access to modern technology. But we don't have so many instruments, and the human rights side becomes very difficult when, if you like, the UN Human Rights Commissioner goes to Xinjiang to look at the condition of the Uyghurs. She writes a critical report, having previously being consciously even-handed as she saw it. So the fact that she wrote a critical report is really quite a step change. The UN Human Rights Council could not pass a resolution to support her report because of Chinese lobbying. The Chinese got 2 more votes than those who wanted to support her. And if you go to somewhere like the OIC, Organization of Islamic States, the Uyghurs are Islamic, and you say you should be doing more to stand up for the Uyghurs and we will help you, you will find that that debate very quickly gets mired in politics. So we've not been very good at taking the politics out of these debates and concentrating on the humanitarian.
And this really makes me think about the type of instruments that you as a diplomat have at hand to kind of induce, as you said, this better behavior around whether or not the issue of human rights or any of the global challenges. And I want to turn to that for a bit. As we were talking in President Johnson's introduction, talking about the various skills that diplomats bring to the table, and one of them that Secretary Albright often talked about was empathy. And I'm curious, in all of these situations, in Afghanistan, in the Balkans, Ukraine, where does empathy come in for you? How important is that for you as a diplomat?
I would say she's right, but that just shows how generous she was. Sometimes you're sitting down with thugs. Sometimes, let's be frank. You have to have an imagination to put yourself in their shoes. Often, not everything they say will be illegitimate or wrong. This is particularly true when dealing with the Russians. And you need to develop an instinct somehow, even if you don't know the country that you're dealing with well, an instinct to kind of sense when something might have a ring of truth about it. And does that give you something to work with? At the same time, you need to be very steely when you hear something that is vexatious, i.e. completely wrong, and thrown up as a smokescreen, and know when to tell people to stop pursuing that line of argument. So I think you have to have both those things constantly in your mind and be evaluating and re-evaluating and listening to their language, looking at what they're doing. And it's different person by person. But you do need imagination, I would say, and you do need to be a good listener.
So if I get one, I don't want to say frivolous question, but I'm going to go for it. Thinking about using one's imagination. So one of the things I know Secretary Albright would do is that she would use her pins to communicate in moments where communication might be difficult. So one of the ones that's really well known is that after the Russians bugged the White House, she appeared with a pin of a bug to express her displeasure. Now, you were involved in really a contentious standoff with the Russians at the United Nations Security Council surrounding poisonings at Salisbury. And I believe it was in the climactic discussions that you appeared in a red boa and a black leather jacket. There were so many media reports, and since I have the opportunity to ask this in person, did you do that on purpose?
I kind of half did it. It's not a motorbike leather jacket, and it was actually a red and black fur. And the Russians used to say I wore exotic furs. You know, they were trying to create this sense of animus towards me, and we couldn't believe our luck. So we were able to put out a press release in response to their, she wears fake fur, you know, she strangles snakes and small animals with her bare hands type of rhetoric. We were able to say the fur is fake, just like Russian news. And we thought we could not believe our luck. You don't often get handed that sort of opening.
And in many ways, this is, I mean, looking at this and looking at the way you use this, I mean, in many ways, you know, very much kind of speaking as a woman in this leadership role. And this is another question I have to ask. You have a number of firsts on your CV, including the first female ambassador to the United Nations from the UK, the first female UK ambassador to the United States. How has it been to operate as the first in this world of men?
I think very conscious of the trust placed in you, and very conscious, I think, that people will use you as a role model for good or bad, whether you want them to or you don't. We have some people in our system who come from minorities who don't like being used as champions. And I think when you get to a certain senior level, whether you want to or you don't, you have to do it. Because if you don't do it, who else is going to do it? And Secretary Albright had this great phrase about there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. And someone had a slightly nicer version of that, which was you had to look, as you climbed the ladder, you had to look behind to make it sure it was still there for the next generation. So all of that is important, and it's part of being a leader. But speaking personally, I was a real girl when I was growing up. I had pretty dresses and nice shoes, not so nice today because I've hurt my ankle. And I really liked all that stuff, but I read boys' books. So I was very pleased to get into the security policy arena and deal with aeroplanes and tanks and ships. I used to draw fighter jets in art class when I was 10 years old. I made model kits of F-14 Tomcats. So I genuinely loved that stuff. I was, although a junior diplomat, I was the first woman they'd ever had in the security policy arena, and I loved every single minute of it, because you were sufficiently unusual that people would notice you, talk to you, take you to meet other people, allow you to speak in meetings. And however scared I was of speaking in front of generals, I was a lot more scared of what my head of department would do to me if I went back to the Foreign Office and say, well, I didn't make that point because they were all senior to me. And that also, in a weird way, was a great motivator. And so when I got more senior, it ceased to be unusual, because it was, if you like, what I had always known throughout the Foreign Office. I do think there is an interesting phenomenon, at least in our system, whereby the older women like me worry less, even though we had, on the face of it, a harder time than some of the younger women who can walk into a room and there'll be 50% women, 50% men. I do think it's interesting that people feel it's harder now, and I don't really know why that is.
So we're heading up on time, so let me then ask you to build on that and ask you to be a role model, because I'm sure that a number of the students that are here today are interested, or they're here because they are interested in a diplomatic career or something to do with global leadership. What advice would you give them? How would you tell them to be resilient?
Oh, well, okay, if my husband were here, my husband would say, you better tell them the one about charm and conciliation. And this is something that my son was told at school when he'd been difficult. And he was told, always charm and conciliation, Jack, even when the master is, and then there was an expletive. Always go for charm and conciliation. I have never done this myself, I have to say. But it is such good advice. If you can turn most situations to your advantage by being the conciliatory one and the charming one, even if that's not how you feel. And if you can make a humorous comment, all the better. And in the end, it will serve you well. But temperamentally, I'm much more with the it'll be all right in the end, and if it's not all right, it's not the end.
Well, we are coming at time. Believe it or not, this seems to have flown by. I want to thank you once again, Ambassador Pierce. It is, again, such an honor to have you here, such a tribute to be able to have you here as we honor Secretary Albright's legacy and talk about democracy and the role of diplomacy in the world. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's great to be here.